In this video, it's time to take our completed character and add some color, or in ZBrush, what we call Polypaint. Polypaint is a ZBrush term that refers to applying paint or color directly on the polygons of the mesh. This is important to understand because this means that the resolution of our mesh will affect the resolution of our paint. Just like the sculpting brush details are dependent on the resolution of the mesh, as we've discussed in the sculpting series. Through the painting process, I'll be using the same mesh created for my character, which I've adjusted the Dynamesh resolution for sculpting purposes, and is giving me a total of 1.2 million polys. This resolution will be more than enough for me to apply clean polypaint to my character. If you find your polypaint resolution is too low or unsatisfactory, be sure to adjust the resolution higher in Dynamesh and re-Dynamesh the surface to add more resolution. To get started, we'll be using one of the same brushes that we've used for sculpting so far, and also one of the easiest brushes to modify for polypainting, which is the standard brush. So let's select it in the brush palette. To apply polypaint on the character, we need to turn on our RGB option for the standard brush. Clicking on the RGB button here will enable this option. Now to paint, let's select a color in the palette. By changing the color, the character will also adjust to the selected color, which is canceling out the paint we are trying to add to the surface. The proper method when polypainting is to first fill the entire character with a base color, and this will give us a blank canvas to paint on. I'll set the base color back to white in the color palette. To fill the character with our base color, we need to navigate to the color palette here. Just below the color palette, we have the Fill Object button. Press the Fill Object button to fill the character with the selected white color. So changing to a different color will no longer update or change the mesh color. We can now successfully polypaint on the mesh. Currently, we're able to sculpt and paint at the same time. You may find this option very useful and speed up your workflow to sculpting and painting together. However, as we've already completed the sculpting process, let's instead focus on applying polypaint without changing our sculpt. Most brushes in ZBrush by default are set to sculpt on the surface, so all we need to do is modify the standard brush and disable the sculpting setting. The sculpting settings for the brush are called Z-Add and Z-Sub, which you can find here at the top with our brush settings. The Z-Add button is currently enabled. Click once on Z-Add to disable this option, and now we can apply polypaint without adding any additional sculptural changes while polypainting with this brush. To change the intensity of our polypaint, we now need to switch over to the RGB intensity slider here. Adjusting the RGB intensity slider to various levels will control the opacity of the polypaint. Press the I key on the keyboard to access the RGB intensity hotkey for quicker access. When choosing colors to polypaint with, we can adjust the main color by adjusting the hue on the outer rim picker while controlling the saturation in the center. Don't forget to open up the larger color palette viewer by clicking on the main color icon. To paint with more flexibility, we can also adjust our secondary color by clicking on it to open up the larger viewer to select a new color. And to paint quickly with both the main and secondary colors, we can use the Alternate feature. Just below the Switch Color button, we have the Alternate button. When this button is enabled, we can press and hold Alt on the keyboard, and this will allow us to paint with the secondary color. Just as the smooth brush will smooth out sculptural detail, it will also smooth polypaint. We can smooth and blend the polypaint by pressing and holding the Shift key to access the smooth brush and smoothing out these areas. In areas where I have sculptural detail, I'm also smoothing this area out. As most brushes are by default set to Z-Add, this also includes the smooth brush. Press and hold the Shift key and navigate to the Z-Add option for the smooth brush and click to disable this. Now I can undo my previous smooth action and smooth the polypaint without affecting the sculptural details. As you can imagine, later down the road, it may come in handy where you would like to smooth both, or maybe just sculpture details, so adjusting these settings will come in handy when you need them. Choosing the proper material while polypainting the surface is also very important. During the sculpting process, I use the current selected material, which is the basic material. This works well because it has nice low intensity shadow settings and shows the sculpture details without changing the surface properties too much, and doesn't have any additional lighting properties that will add color to the mesh. For example, let's select the chrome blue tint material. Although the chrome material looks cool now as an after effect, this material is adding this blue tint to the surface and covering up my polypaint. For the painting process, it's good practice to follow those same guidelines and now select a material that will best represent my polypaint information. The skin shade material, located here, is an excellent material for polypainting and will show off our polypaint much more clearly. At this point, we've applied this process to the character's body subtool, and as we're switching to different colors, the eyes are continuing to follow those selections. We'll need to do this same process for each separate object or subtool within our scene. So I'll quickly select my eyes subtool and change my color to white, then navigate to the color palette and press Fill Object. So that should do it for the introduction to polypainting. In the next video, I'll be discussing some basic polypainting techniques as well as modifying our brushes even further for more efficient polypainting. Thanks for visiting Z Classroom. I'll see you in the next video.